My name is Indu Mitchell. I'm with PMD Alliance, and you are joining us today on a conversation around demoralization. So I feel this is such an important topic, and I'm so excited that we have two of the authors of a paper that was called From Hopelessness to Hope, Addressing Demoralization in Parkinson's Disease. We had Dr. Indu Subramanian and Bradley McDaniels, who were a part of the team of authors who are going to be sharing what this is and what this means for people with you today. A lot of you know Dr. Subramanian because she has been a long time friend of ours and expert contributor to programming. But for those of you who might be new to the PMD Alliance family, I want to introduce her to you. So she is a movement disorder specialist. She practices at UCLA Neurological Services, and she's director of the Southwest VA Medical Center, the PADRECC there. So that's a Parkinson's disease research, education, and clinical center in Los Angeles. And she's also a clinical professor at UCLA. So we're very excited to have Dr. Indu Subramanian. And then also with us today is Bradley McDaniels. He is an assistant professor in the Rehabilitation and Health Services Department of the College of Health and Public Services at the University of North Texas in Denton, Texas. He is a PhD in rehabilitation counseling and real education, research, and policy from the University of Kentucky. And so we're excited to have two experts in this share this important topic. So I am going to hand this over to Dr. Subramanian and to Dr. McDaniels.
All right. Thanks, Anissa. Here come the slides. All right. Here we go. Indu, let you kick us off.
We're really excited to bring this topic to all of you. I think it was something that had kind of resonated with us. We were reading about it and kind of just a word that kept popping up. And as you'll see throughout sort of the slide deck, we have woven some of the work that we've been kind of contributing to and really trying to move the needle from the 120, honestly, interviews that were around the pandemic and patient voices and different things that ended up coming out of some of the interviews here. Brad and I ended up really getting sort of focused on mental health. So you remember Parkinson's has the bucket of motor symptoms, non-motor symptoms, and then mental health is a huge part of it. And the psychological reaction to getting the diagnosis and living with this chronic disease that changes your identity. And as you'll see, sort of some of the pieces that we'll weave through, stigma, loneliness, and things like that. Hopefully you can kind of see if this resonates with you, and perhaps, as we're going through, think about how some of this is perhaps shown up in your own life, or if you're a caregiver, the life of the person that you love and care for. And then we'd love to have sort of questions and a discussion at the end, but we'll share some of our slides at first. And so next slide, Brad.
All right. So kind of as Indu led into this, one of the challenges with Parkinson's is how many areas of one's life get affected at diagnosis, right? And so there's all of these thoughts that go through our minds, right? My life as I know it is over. I'm not going to be able to do the job I was doing. My role in the house is going to change potentially. And so we have all of these emotional reactions, and we can end up with some reactive depression, could end up with real depression, right? Anxiety. But there's also the spiritual component of this, which Indu and I have talked about quite in depth, about the role that plays in well-being and how well we can continue to engage in our lives. But at the end of the day, Parkinson's affects every part of our bodies, right? And it also, and one of the other things that Indu mentioned is the caregiver piece. And I think hopefully as we go through this today, you'll be able to see, if you're a care partner who's on this call today, we hope that you'll be able to see how these things affect you as much as they affect the person with Parkinson's. So we're going to talk about each of these areas a little bit more in depth as we go, but just an overview, understanding that Parkinson's disease does not discriminate against what parts of ourselves that it affects.
So we wrote this paper about giving the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease, and through my interviews and trying to listen to the patient voice, and even the paper that we're going to be talking about around demoralization includes not just me as a movement disorder neurologist, but Dr. McDaniels here, who's a psychologist, and some other mental health folks, psychiatrists that we work with, but also patient voices. And so as you see through our work, we've sort of tried to reflect patient voices and sort of their thoughts to us, and think about how we can change the way we approach clinical care in reflecting how to do better. So a lot of folks said that when they got the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease those many years ago, they remember with crystal clarity everything about that day, and it's the day that changed their lives. They remember the smell of the room, the paint color, the light, and everything, because that day forward was the day that their life really changed, and all these negative sort of reactions were felt by some of the folks that we talked to. Things from hopelessness, grief, anxiety, shame, feeling a sense of fear, and anger even. And then this word demoralized kind of kept coming up. And we just didn't know exactly what that meant in the context of Parkinson's disease. Next slide.
So as we were talking about this, Indu and Greg Pontone and I, when we were doing some of these other papers, we just got into this discussion about demoralization. And Greg brought up the fact that it was very prevalent in the cancer literature, right? End-stage cancer disease, people are feeling these feelings that aren't depression, but they mimic depression in a lot of ways. And so we began looking into this, and what we found was demoralization, really, to keep it simple, is an inability to cope with what's going on in my life. And it leads to a sense of helplessness. I don't know what to do, right? I've got this issue. I just received this diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. I don't have any idea how to proceed. And then helplessness as well, or hopelessness. I don't have anything to look forward to. It's an incurable disease. There's really nothing I can do to prevent this from progressing and getting worse. Meaninglessness. The things that I thought were bringing my life meaning may change now. I may not be able to do the job that I was doing. My role at home may change, and I'm not able to do that. And those things brought me meaning in life. And all of a sudden now that's over. And I think, what is there now? And interestingly, Clark and Kassane, when they started this discussion about demoralization, they call it subjective incompetence. And that's a little bit of a pejorative term if we think about that. But really all that is I don't have the ability to cope with what's going on. I'm just not sure what to do next. And this affects every part of us: self-esteem, self-confidence, self-concept, self-efficacy, all of the things that we need to be able to live the best life we can with Parkinson's disease are impacted through demoralization.
So when you think about the sort of time frame, so you have, I guess, before diagnosis, right? You have the sense that I have so many things to look forward to. I've worked my life. I'm about to retire and really enjoy the golden years. And or if you're a younger person, you may be in the middle of your life and sort of got the education and finally had a family and things like that. And you have this illusion that you have a certain future that's promised to you. And then all of a sudden you get the diagnosis, and that really changes. The sense of purpose changes, your sense of identity changes, and people start to feel uncertain about what their future looks like. They don't feel like they have control over the future. And there's a sense of helplessness. They don't know how to help themselves. And again, this sort of sense that they can't cope. And then, they try to seek help. So they may go back to the doctor and say, you gave me this diagnosis and I just really need some help. And if they don't feel like somebody's really listening to them, or they have no one to listen to them, they ask their spouse, they ask their sister, and there's really nobody who's able to address this issue, or they may not even feel comfortable bringing it up. Then they get into the sense of hopelessness. They get isolated, they feel ashamed, and they feel very stigmatized. They say, I'm very different than everybody around me. And so, this can lead to sort of the sense that you're alone, and then you withdraw. So you have the sense that you're sort of, no one else can understand what's going on with you. And this withdrawal and the lack of social connection can really lead to a sense of anxiety, depression, apathy, and then all of that can also lead into a poor quality of life, not just from your motor symptoms getting worse, but just the global sense that your life is not of good quality. So I think this is sort of the cascade that we had heard from patients. And when we look at the cancer literature or other literatures, there's sort of this timeline. And so I think as we talk through this, maybe you can sort of also kind of reflect on, how did I feel before my diagnosis? Then I got my diagnosis. was I coping well? You know, did I go through these feelings, or am I in the middle of this in the moment? And have I isolated and withdrawn myself? And so are there ways that I can kind of break this cycle here? So we mentioned the word stigma, and stigma is something that I don't think we've paid much attention to in the Parkinson's space. But you know, this is something that I think we, as neurologists, as movement disorder specialists, have really been thinking about more. You know, there's obvious cases of stigma in places like Africa where people may be shunned by society. There's a sense that the disease is contagious, or that they did something wrong and they were possessed, or a witch cursed them, and that's why they got Parkinson's. But I think even in this society, there's some sense that, you know, perhaps somebody did something wrong to get this, or that there's, you know, they took drugs, or they were at fault, and that's why they got something like Parkinson's. Some of this is propagated perhaps in the media. Sometimes people are not aware enough about what is going on with this disease. So there are some facilitators of stigma just in our society. Then there's these sort of three buckets that drive stigma. So there's the biological things, like what are the obvious things that look different in a person living with Parkinson's. Then there's a psychological reaction that sometimes, you know, there's shame and blame on yourself if you're living with this, something you did. And then there's these sort of stereotypes and discrimination that you may feel from society. And really, when we think about stigma, there's sort of the public sort of sense that this public is putting stigma on you, like this community that I live in feels like I'm different and they're excluding me. But there's also this felt stigma in which we, you know, when we feel stigmatized by society, we may think that from ourselves that somebody in the community or someone in society has a negative connotation, and that's actually another layer that we then are putting extra sort of felt stigma on ourselves, and extra shame and blame. And so this can have a lot of consequences, from social isolation, the psychology of things, and we put the word demoralization here in this figure. And then sometimes people can then conceal their symptoms or not come forward to the healthcare providers, and tend to use the medical system less because of some of the consequences of stigma. The good news is that stigma can be mitigated, and we'll talk about, just like demoralization can be changed, we have some ways in which we, as the healthcare system, as well as you and your family, and other folks in your team, can help mitigate stigma. And we'll talk a little bit about that.
So along those lines, right, and we've talked a little bit about what happens when one gets this diagnosis of Parkinson's disease and how things change in our lives. And you know, each of us has these things that we deem are really important, the values that we have, the activities that we engage in that really mean a lot to us. Things like physical health, mental health, work, relationships, family, right? These things are critically important to my quality of life. And as one gets a chronic illness like Parkinson's disease that's progressive and takes away some of our faculties, we begin to have quality of life decrease. And it was a motto put together back in 2005 by Malachi Bishop at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, talking about this idea of disability centrality. And he explains it that whenever these areas that I feel are really important to my life are negatively impacted, my identity suffers. And, you know, it began to make sense to me. I read about this years ago, and we started talking about it in the Parkinson's world. And when we look at things like role loss, right? We talked about, maybe I'm the primary breadwinner in my house. Maybe I'm the one who does most of the work around the house, keeping the house in order. I can no longer do those things. Who am I? Right? I have a reduced agency, my belief in my ability to be able to do something, who I am, what I'm capable of. When those things begin to go away, my quality of life goes down. And clearly, right when that happens, I begin to be helpless and hopeless. And then demoralization begins to set in, and I don't know what to do. And that's when the challenge becomes problematic, is I get stuck in this place. And because of stigma that Indu just talked about, now we've got an identity issue, and maybe I'm less willing to engage in society like I used to, be involved in the things that used to bring me joy, because I'm cognizant of how people view me and really how I'm beginning to view myself. And so really, why the question becomes, why are we even talking about this, right? This sounds a lot like depression. And it does. When we did this research, we found that a whole lot of times demoralization and depression cross over from a clinical diagnosis standpoint. But there are some things that are essential to demoralization. We talked about it. It's this idea that I can't cope with my life. Depression is really more of an anhedonia, the inability to experience pleasure in the things in my life. So I could be demoralized and be able to experience pleasure, but still not know how to cope with the struggles that I'm dealing with. So you can see maybe how those two things separate. And because demoralization is so prevalent, we see it, and even the numbers that we have today, I don't really think that they catch how much demoralization is going on in the community at large or in the PD community in particular. But it reduces quality of life. It reduces my desire to engage socially, right? Loneliness is another thing that typically will creep up when this happens. Combine that with stigma, right? And then I'm less engaged. Poor treatment adherence. Because I feel hopeless and helpless, just like, why bother, right? I'm not going to do the things that my movement disorder doctor asks me to do. Increased depression, anxiety, right? All of these mental health challenges begin to combine over time. Suicidal ideation was an interesting one. And it struck me, again, as we were writing this paper, to find that people who were demoralized had a higher rate of suicidal ideation than people who were depressed. I did not see that coming. I really thought it would be the reverse of that because we hear so much about depression in the media and potential suicide. That was a striking finding for me about how significant this problem is. And then you combine that with faster motor and cognitive functioning. Your symptoms get worse whenever we're experiencing these psychological mental health traumas. And again, I talked about the isolation, loneliness, and how about the burden that comes with having Parkinson's disease, feeling like the person who is helping you, your care partner, you don't want them to feel like they've got to do everything for you. And again, leads right back to it's this vicious cycle that I begin to feel helpless, I begin to feel hopeless, and life as I know it is kind of over, right?
So we mentioned loneliness, and loneliness is a hugely impactful situation that can affect many of us, just even without Parkinson's. And the data shows that if you are lonely, just as a general member of society, that it puts you at a higher risk of bad outcomes like death and hospitalizations than things like than obesity and smoking a half a pack of cigarettes a day. So this is a very important risk factor for many, many diseases. And there was very little study in the Parkinson's space. So Dr. Lori Mishley and I wrote this paper back in 2020, which was just as the pandemic was unfolding, about the impact of loneliness. She has a large database of patients that she's been following for, I think, almost 10 years now, that are filling out questionnaires every 6 months. And we're trying to see what are the things that we can modify in people's lives to help them live better with Parkinson's. And we were very struck by the fact that loneliness and the negative effects of loneliness were as bad for you as the positive effects of exercising 7 days a week for 30 minutes a day is good for you. And so, the sense that, we all say that exercise is medicine, well, being lonely is actually very detrimental to your health. And so I think, anything we can do to sort of start thinking about these impacts of things like at diagnosis, then getting a diagnosis, ending up demoralized, ending up sort of isolated and lonely, and then how that can affect your global health is really, how can we break that cycle is so important. So we wrote in our paper, and this is from our paper, and here we list all our co-authors, and a shout out to some of our folks living themselves with Parkinson's. So Kuhan Pushparatnam, Sonia Mathur, who's a physician in Canada, and Dr. Becca Miller, who is a psychologist, all contributed to this paper, along with two psychiatrists you see here, Dr. Bradley and Dr. Pontone. And we really talked about, what are ways that we can negatively worsen demoralization, and then how can we stop these things from worsening things, or how can we mitigate these sort of issues? And so I, as a doctor, as a neurologist, can look at, are there symptoms that are improperly treated? And maybe I can try to help change the medications around, help people get sleeping better and things like that, to perhaps address the biological sort of aspects. There's also depression, anxiety. Sometimes we have medications for these things like apathy and other approaches. So we can screen for some of these issues and try to address them by being vigilant about mental health issues. There's the psychological aspects, which I'll let Brad talk about.
Yeah, so these things that we've been talking about thus far, we talked about stigma, the psychological distress that happens when one is given the diagnosis of an incurable chronic illness, right? Uncertainty is a big one with Parkinson's disease. It's another one that Indu and Greg and I have been talking about, this whole idea of intolerance of uncertainty. How is it that I react when I have no idea what to expect? Right? Maybe you go in and see your movement disorders doctor and you get diagnosed with Parkinson's disease and you say, what can I expect moving forward? Right? That's a difficult question for someone to ask because the trajectory of this disease changes for everyone. And that's a challenge, to not know what's going to happen today and tomorrow. My self-esteem suffers. I could have body habitus changes. I could begin to not be able to do the things that I used to be able to do. So I begin to struggle with who I am, and again, the identity piece. And all of these things that come from this diagnosis of Parkinson's disease, there are ways that we can implement strategies to help improve those, helping someone find hope, right? Knowing that everything in my life is not over. There are some areas that I may be struggling with, but there are other areas maybe that are underdeveloped that I'm not even aware of that I can and rely on. Building resilience, learning to set maybe small goals in life that are achievable and achieve those goals. And over time, we do that repeatedly. We can begin to build this sense of resilience, which really is just the ability to bounce back, right? Following some kind of a struggle. Inner peacefulness, you might find this through mindfulness meditation, through spirituality, right? A connection with a higher power is a way that lets you just be able to be in the moment and not be so focused on maybe what you don't have. And finding meaning and goal setting. Meaning in life is something that again we've talked about over the last few years that we've been working together. And what I can say for certain is in the literature on meaning in life, everything gets better when you have meaning and purpose. And conversely, things get worse when we lose it. So working on how can we find meaning again, because again, oftentimes when we ask people where they find meaning in life, it's through work, it's through relationships, and it's through spirituality. Those are the top three that are across all of the literature published on this. And oftentimes we lose that ability to work. Our relationships may be affected. So we've got to begin to reevaluate is how can we instill some meaning and find purpose again in our lives and begin to foster that over time.
And then, we mentioned the social aspects, and I think, Brad, there's just a question in the chat about these short forms that are in here, like the cognitive therapies, IMCP, ACT.
Oh, yeah. Meaning-centered therapy is IMCP, individualized meaning center psychotherapy. ACT is acceptance and commitment therapy. And just completely lost my train of thought. Cognitive therapy, drawn a blank. Help me. I
Look
totally
that up.
forget.
There's so many cognitive types of therapies that
I know.
I will look
Not
that up.
meaning centered. Yeah, I forget what it's called right now. Caught me off guard.
Yes, we'll get back to you because I'm looking that up too. It's like I want to say it's like yeah, we'll look it up.
Go ahead to the next part.
As I'm talking about the next one, you can look it up, Brad. So, and then, social wise, there's, but just all these therapies are largely done one-on-one with a psychologist or a social worker who's a therapist. And usually it is pretty intensive and can take some sessions, 6 to 10 sessions. Sometimes there can be group-based therapies as well. There's, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy that can also be used and some of those can be in group sessions. So all sort of working with mental health experts in different ways. But not everyone has access to those, which we do realize as well. And so then the social aspects. So as we mentioned, loneliness, can be a predisposing factor to demoralization, being single, living alone, being unemployed. And so things like joining a support group, which may not be for everyone, finding a PD mentor or PD buddy. So finding another person living with Parkinson's who may be able to kind of help you along the journey, engaging with family and friends, and keeping these people engaged throughout your disease sort of continuum. So a lot of my patients will say, Doc, I didn't tell anyone in my life about my Parkinson's and I was hiding it. I became isolated. And then all of a sudden, when I actually wanted to engage with people, there was no one really left in my life who cared about me because I had shut them out. And so I think being intentional, and we as your treatment team need to also help folks understand how important this is from diagnosis, and bringing perhaps someone in your life who cares about you, that you feel comfortable bringing them into the visit so that they can feel as part of the treatment team. They can ask questions as well and help to keep you kind of connected and engaged is part of the medicine. That again, this religious and spiritual support, if that's something that's available to you. We put this concept of social prescribing in here, which is literally like, I as a physician can identify people who may need social support, can screen for loneliness, things like I often or sometimes feel left out, I often or sometimes feel isolated, these sort of simple questions. And then go from there. And we can then kind of find connection in your community with resources, perhaps a yoga class or a gardening class or whatever may be catered to you, and help you stay connected through sort of folks in your own community. There's a question about, what if you don't believe in God? Well, you don't have to believe in God. I think the spiritual side, I think when we're talking about this, and I actually wrote a paper that's hopefully going to come out soon about spirituality. It's really, I think, not necessarily about a specific religious faith or religious organization that you belong to, but really what in your life brings you comfort. And so sort of for some people, it may be God or the belief in God, but for some people, it may be sort of more of a, being present in your body and your mind and sort of still. It may be in nature, some different things that bring you comfort, maybe your pet, maybe other people, so really sort of thinking about, from a spiritual side, what helps you cope when you're finding yourself in places where you need help. And then, I do write about the treatment team, and I've seen some comments already about this here. So one of the things that we realized as we're going through this is really, as I mentioned, when you get diagnosed and you don't feel well and you come back and you're talking perhaps to someone on the team about how you're feeling, and you're met with sort of blank stares or not being validated, sometimes that can actually cycle back and make you feel worse, and make you feel then that you don't trust the treatment team, or that you feel not seen, not heard, and then you may want to isolate further. And I think, I don't want to behave like medicine is a walk in the park these days. I think receiving medical care is stressful, and being on the delivery end of medical care is ever increasingly stressful. Lots of folks leaving medicine, lots of issues with time and RVU sort of needing to get to the next patient. People are rushed. And so, I think the sense is that somebody in your world should have the ability to take what you're feeling, process it, and feed back to someone on the treatment team. And we'll talk about the fact that it may not just be your neurologist. You may have other allies, and we'll talk about that in an upcoming slide. But that I think we are giving these talks to our folks on the treatment team side, the provider side, and really hoping that people can identify the fact that, this is a real problem that patients face, that they may need to have extra support at that point of diagnosis, be met with compassion, give time and attention, that the clinician should reinforce their values and as a person, and validate these feelings, and really ultimately that the therapeutic alliance of the person living with Parkinson's and their doctor and their team should be one where people feel seen, heard, and supported and validated, so that people can come forward with what really, is bothering them, what types of symptoms are happening behind the scenes, perhaps in this mental health space, which requires, trust in your treatment team. So I think we're sort of trying to educate from the provider standpoint, and hopefully you can bring also forward some of these issues if you're having them to your providers, because you have to intentionally really ask often. Patients don't necessarily bring it forward. So I think you guys can do that as a community of patients and caregivers as well. Next slide.
So it makes sense why I couldn't come up with WBCT because it's a typo.
Oh,
That's
okay.
MBCT, mindfulness.
Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. Okay, that's what we were talking
I
about.
was
Okay.
thinking, where in the world did that come from?
Okay. All right. Yes. Okay. Next slide. So I love the work of Viktor Frankl. As we were talking about resilience, I think that, people often, are so sort of surprised about the diagnosis. It wasn't something that we're expecting, obviously. And so then when all of these sort of uncertainty comes in, people can find it very overwhelming. But I think when we break it down, I think we as humans have this need to feel in control, to know what our future holds. And I think that in the resilience sort of space, I think that every single one of us, no matter who we are going to face adversity at some point. So I love this quote from Viktor Frankl: "Man's search for meaning. Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given circumstance, to choose one's own way." And I think we hope to instill the fact that you as people living with Parkinson's have to feel like it is your own way, that this is something that you're choosing and that you have your own self-efficacy. If that's taken away from you, we as doctors just tell you what to do, or your caregiver just constantly tells you exactly what to do, that's often takes away your value as a person and can also lead to demoralization. Next slide. So we mentioned the sort of multidisciplinary team and having the patient in the middle with their loved one or caregiver. This is sort of the reimagined whole health wheel of, what are the things that you can do for yourself to live better every day. We have these lifestyle choices and the folks that can support you through things like sleep, exercise, diet, mind-body approaches, and social connection. These are the sort of core things that we think are the pillars of lifestyle choices that can help people in their Parkinson's wellness. We also have to think about optimizing general medical issues and mental health as part of that. And then we write here about meaning and purpose, and the folks that can really help guide this include things like psychologists and faith-based resources, along with other folks on the team. But I think you can see here that, a lot of the frustration is that the movement disorder neurologist may not be available, or, or a neurologist may not even be in the picture, but like who in this sort of universe of other folks on the multidisciplinary team may be able to take some of the burden off of those neurologic visits and support you between your visits include all of the folks on the pedals, including the support group community, as well as, the psychologists and faith-based resources. So I will let Brad tell you a little bit about meaning and purpose. And this slide is part of our new paper that should be released very soon. Stand by, hot off the press soon. It was finally accepted with all its revisions in movement disorders and clinical practice. And this is literally from our wellness task force at the Movement Disorder Society, where 20 of us in the world thought about, what are some ways to help support patients living with Parkinson's and this, proactive lifestyle approach sort of prescription. So we will talk more about that once the paper's out, but this is the figure from that paper.
Yeah, so you've heard Indu talk about Viktor Frankl, and I talked a little bit about meaning and purpose earlier. It's a significant area of focus, and I think that as we've talked, as we've been writing these papers, one of the things that we think is critically important is that we give some tools that will allow you to deal with whatever challenge we're talking about, right? It doesn't do us a whole lot of good to tell you that demoralization goes along with Parkinson's disease if we can't say these are some things that you can do to resolve it. And so as we talked about these, we were thinking, and what does the literature tell us about interventions that can be done? And meaning and purpose comes pretty much with all of the problems that we've seen here with stigma and loneliness and relationships. And I gave a few areas here that being able to identify what your values are. What are the things that you value in life? And then engaging in activities that align with those values. Anytime we find ourselves at odds with our values, we tend to have psychological distress. And it's really important that we work on on doing things that are aligning with that. And one of the ways that we can do this is to find character strengths. And I've got a link in this slideshow here, VIA, Values in Action Character Strengths. And it's a way that you can find what are the things that that mostly make up you: bravery, hope, courage, love, helpfulness, right? And find out what those things are in you, and then find ways to use those in my daily life. If I find that courage is one of my main character strengths, how can I display courage in things that I engage in? Maybe it's that I'm scared to go to this social engagement, but I'm going to do it anyway, right? You let that courage be the thing that drives you. And that in itself can help us begin to develop purpose in our lives. Engage in general acts of kindness. That's such an easy one, right? Anytime that we do pro-social things with other people, we are always the ones who get the most out of it. And so, can I find ways in my day to encourage someone else? Maybe it's a note, maybe it's a text, maybe it's a phone call to that person that you just think, I'm thinking about you and I really appreciate what you've done in my life. Those things help give meaning and purpose to our lives. And, we talked about loneliness in a number of papers that we've written about, and it's a real issue. But one of the top three reasons I talked about in the ways that people find meaning in their life, one of the top three is social connection and relationships. So it goes without saying that if we foster social connection, if we make time in our week, say, you know what, I'm going to have coffee with someone this week. I'm going to make a phone call to someone this week, and I'm going to have a conversation. That can also help foster meaning and purpose in our lives. And as Indu was talking about a second ago, spiritual and reflective practices. Sometimes it's just mindfulness, being right here where I'm at right now. I've got a friend who always says it's important for me to be where my feet are. And I like that saying, that focus on where I'm at right now, not where I've been and not where I'm unsure that I'm going to go, right? Because we don't know what the future holds. And so it's recognizing our breathing, recognizing the things around me. We can use our senses. Identify 5 things that you see right now, 4 things that you hear, 3 things that you taste, right? It's a counseling intervention that we use with people to help ground them and get them to where I'm only focused on the here and now. And those things can help significantly. And they're simple. I like simple solutions to some of these problems. The other thing that we talk about regularly is gratitude. And Robert Emmons is a guy, he's an emeritus professor from out at UC. I think he's at San Francisco. No, it's Irving, UC Irving. And he's been the foremost expert on gratitude for the last 30 years. And if we look at the benefits of gratitude, it's real similar to meaning and purpose. Everything in my life gets better when I have gratitude, right? And so there are things that we can do that are really easy to foster a sense of gratitude. And I've given you a few options here. 3 good things. Write down every day 3 good things that happened. Doesn't have to be long. I got a phone call from my daughter. I went grocery shopping and I took a nap, right? 3 things that happened that day. Then a gratitude journal. A gratitude journal is a little bit more in-depth, and it can be a lot for some people to do it every day, but it's just sitting down and writing down the things in your life that you're grateful for, right? I'm grateful for these relationships that I have. I'm grateful for my spouse. I'm grateful for the Parkinson's community in general, right? Begin to spend some time thinking about what those things are that you're grateful for. Then just simple expressions of gratitude. Call someone up and tell them what you're grateful for about them. I really value your friendship because you're always there whenever I have a problem and your advice is always helpful. Something like that. But be specific why you're grateful for them. I like this idea of mental subtraction of positives. It sounds weird, but it's what if I took some of these things in my life that I take for granted and took them away? How would my life be? Right? I'm grateful for my spouse, but if I didn't have my spouse, what would my life look like? If I think that to myself, I begin to go, I am really grateful that I have my spouse, because all of these things that he or she do for me really make my life easier. So just think about what your life would be like without some of these things that you maybe take for granted on a daily basis. And then cognitive reframing, that's a psychological term that we talk about being really simple. Just change the way you think, right? It's not helpful to tell someone that, but if you can give them little things where, you know what, this Parkinson's disease has really been a challenge in my life, but maybe it's allowed me to connect with some people that I never would have connected with before the disease. And that's a positive, right? And so how can I look at the things that I'm encountering in my daily life that might be a struggle, that might make me frustrated, and see if there's a way that I can get some positive out of that? That begins to build our gratitude over time.
And just on that point, I think, you know, I think a couple things. So one is volunteerism. I think that you can always find somebody that's, I think, worse off than you. Certainly at the VA, I feel that every day. I'm lucky to have a home and a bed and, like light and energy, like clean water. I mean, you could just, expand it. And even as a Parkinson's doc, who works, with sometimes limited resources, my colleagues in Africa don't have access to even levodopa for their patients, and those patients are struggling every day without basic medications to help them. So I think, I feel very lucky in some ways to have all the things, and if we can change something to make somebody else's life who has less than us better, we also get some positive sort of chemicals flowing, and it improves our quality of life at the end in various ways. So I think we can continue to build on this, but we wanted to just make sure that you realize that what demoralization is, and that I'll let Brad allow you to sort of cap off the last four things that we want people to
Yeah.
remember, and then
You know,
we'll
I just,
open it
you
up.
know, Indu, you made me think, and I'm just going to share this because I think it's an applicable story for gratitude. I was working in a counseling center, gosh, it's probably been 8, 9 years ago at this point. And I was working with a young man who was struggling with substance use disorder. And one of the things that I asked him to do was write a gratitude list. And I said, write this list for me of all the things you're grateful for. And when you're done, show it to me. And I saw him the next day in the center, and he came back and he said, I'm done. And I was like, really? Already? And he showed me a sheet of notebook paper, and he had a line down the middle, and he had one half of that sheet filled with things he was grateful for. And I glanced at it and I tore it up and I threw it away. And he kind of gave me a funny look like, what's that for? And I said, let me help you get started. I said, you have 2 eyes, 2 ears, a nose and a mouth. You can walk, you can talk. You've got 5 fingers on each hand, 5 toes on each foot, et cetera, right? And when I told him that, it clicked for him. But I need that reminder in my life too. For all of the things that I look at that I wish were different, that I'm frustrated about, that I'm angry about, there are always more things that I have to be grateful for, always. And it's really just that cognitive shift of which list do I want to focus on, my struggles or the things that I have to be grateful for. So I thought I'd share that. That was meaningful to me many years ago, and I'll never forget that. But again, we're on the last slide here, and it's understanding that demoralization is this idea of I don't have the coping skills that I need to deal with the problems that I'm facing. And it's this helplessness, hopelessness. My life loses its meaning and purpose, and I really don't know what to do. And so we've got to try to begin to instill some things that can help as coping strategies. Meaning and purpose is a coping strategy. Developing resilience is a coping strategy. Developing hope is a coping strategy. Relationships, right? All of the things that we've talked about can help offset demoralization and the challenges that it poses on our lives. And then it's purposeful action. It's demoralization is not on its own just going to resolve, right? In fact, if we don't do anything, odds are pretty good that it's going to get worse because there are going to be new things in my life, in my Parkinson's journey that I'm encountering that are going to be troublesome, right? And that's never going to stop. And so I have to decide I want to do some things to offset demoralization. And not just demoralization, these things offset a whole lot of things like anxiety and stress. Being grateful helps those things. Gratitude is a huge intervention. And what I love about gratitude is it's so simple. You don't have to go talk to someone. You don't have to make an appointment with your movement disorder neurologist. All you've got to do is begin looking at your life and finding things that you're grateful for. And lastly, social connection. Indu talked about that, right? That this whole social prescribing thing, when people are alone, things are worse. It's just really that simple. When I don't feel like I have someone that I can call, when I don't have somebody in my life who I feel like cares about me, my problems just grow and grow and grow. But something happens, a problem shared is a problem lessened. So whenever I have that social connection and I've got friends in my life, I begin to feel better about who I am, my identity, and the struggles that I'm going through. So hopefully through what we've shared for the last 45 minutes, there's been something, some type of a nugget that maybe you can walk away with that'll maybe make your life a little bit better tomorrow than it was today. I will shut these slides off and we will.
Yeah. So I see a couple of other questions in the chat that I can just sort of quickly. So somebody said something about what if I am more alone? Okay, what if I'm spending more time alone but don't feel lonely? So technically, loneliness, the definition is sort of the gap between the desires that you the relationships that you desire and the relationships that you have. So that felt sense of like, even though I'm surrounded by, 20 people in my, assisted living, but I have zero meaningful relationships with a single one of them. You can feel lonely in a room full of people. And by the same token, if you're alone, but you have, one or two meaningful relationships that really fill your teacup, then that means that you're, you may live alone or whatever, but you're not lonely. So I think that these are not, they're different than the word social connection or social connectivity. We can measure those with the interactions of who lives in your house and how many people you talk to, but really this loneliness is a subjective feeling. So that's important to realize. And I think that, there's been some thoughts around, what if you don't have a a prefab support group that is right in your community. I think online resources are great. And there was also just one question that I'll take a stab at, and then Brad can also add to this. Is there gender differences in the experience of demoralization? I think that's a really good question. I mean, in our universe of Parkinson's, there was very, very little data on demoralization in general. And so some of the work that we put in here is brand new and just trying to introduce the concept here to our community and see what we may be able to easily construct as ideas to help people. But, the sense that stigma and some of the other issues that happen when we get a diagnosis that is stigmatizing, those sorts of things can affect, and loneliness similarly can affect my already minoritized populations worse, because you already feel like you are different or othered by the regular society and your community, and you may already have sort of a gap between your ability to access the health system and other things just from the way things are formulated. And we have a definite sense that women living with Parkinson's, young women, older women, already have huge gaps in care and in the way that they come sometimes forward with symptoms, sometimes how they're met by the health system. Delays in diagnosis, delays in referral, delays in care, and often end up not getting the care that other folks get with Parkinson's. And they also have very unique psychological and psychosocial issues. So often, because of they get a lot of identity and value in being caregivers, and that sort of caregiver role. If they can't be a good caregiver to their kids or their husband or their mother-in-law, they feel very negative. And so there's a lot of thoughts about shame and blame and self-hate actually in women. So I would assume that by all of that information, that the demoralization that women experience in this disease and getting the diagnosis would be higher and different, and probably also then supported in a different way, perhaps by women in their lives, and have better sort of ability to come forward with these issues around other women. But I don't know that there's much data. Brad, do you have a sense of that?
No, there's not. And as you were answering that, Indu, I was thinking the one The one demographic that is different in demoralization is the young onset population, right? Because think about it, they're diagnosed at a young age. They're in the middle of their careers typically. They may have young kids at home, and they have a lot longer life typically left to deal with their Parkinson's disease. So we see it much greater in that population than we do. It's no less significant, right? It's just if we just look at sheer numbers and differences. That was the only thing that we saw when we were putting this paper together that looked different from a demographic perspective. One question I see here, someone asked, relate demoralization to abulia. Yeah, you're really talking about apathy at this point, right? And demoralization and apathy can coincide, right? So you think about it, that you begin to have these feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, and I have no meaning left in my life, so I'm just not going to leave the house. It's over. Why bother anymore? That can lead to a syndrome that looks a lot like apathy. It may not be clinical apathy as we diagnose it with an apathy evaluation scale or Starkstein apathy scale, one of those measures, but they can coexist, but they are separate constructs. So hopefully that helps. Most effective thing I can do for my husband. This just changed. Hold on, let me get back here. Do as a caregiver to help my husband feel better. Uh, there's a lot there. I think one of the things that we need to do when we're as care partners is help them find find the ways that they want you to help them, right? I think so often that we want to step in and help our care partner do things that maybe they're not wanting help with. They need to be able to have their own agency, to be able to do the things that they're capable of without me jumping in and thinking, I'll do that for you. So I think the beginning of that starts with a conversation, right? What is it that you need from me? And what is it that you would like me to do? I think when we have that conversation, it can certainly help outcomes. I think the other thing, and I have this conversation with my mom and dad, that my dad will tell me, you know, Brad, your mom's not exercising like she should. And I say, Dad, are you doing it with her? Right? So I'm like, how can we do things together that are beneficial? Let's take a walk. Let's go out in nature. Let's go to a movie. Let's watch a show on TV together, right? We talked about relationships and how much that social connection matters. Oftentimes we live in a house with someone, but we're not socially connected. We're just there. We're not alone, as Indu talked a second ago. We're not alone because there are people with us, but we might be very lonely because there's no connection. There's that qualitative piece that's missing. So I encourage that connection with your loved one. Have a conversation. How can we do some things that are enjoyable? What would make your day better? And help that. And then help them look at things in their life that they've still got to be grateful for. That was a lot that I threw out there. I was just kind of brainstorming to come up with these things, but I think following some of those guidelines can be really helpful as well.
And there's a question about how do you get these concepts across to someone who is resistant to therapy or wellness? I mean, I think the problem with categorizing things in a mental health domain is that there's a huge stigma with mental health and getting therapy, right, from a psychiatrist or those shrinks over there, or the psychologist. So we actually, in our clinic at the VA, have a psychiatrist that literally sits next to me, and we go in together, and, you know, it's just part of the regular evaluation. And we really talk about the fact that this disease includes, you know, a mental health component and a psychological component that we're trying to kind of, you know, sort of make evident from just even the chemical imbalance that's part of the Parkinson's and the reaction to getting the disease. So it's not a separate problem, and you've not, you know, that's not like you're going crazy with, you know, the sort of stigma of that. This is part of the disease. And so in order to live better, we're sort of focusing on a multi-pronged approach that includes things that can help your mental health, but certainly the wellness concept of, you know, modifiable variables like sleep and exercise and diet and social connection. All of these things actually directly impact motor symptoms as well as the mental health component, and all of these things feed back into each other. But it's just sort of a concept of like, we are finally in the Parkinson space where, for example, the field of cardiology with heart attacks was like 40 years ago, right? So we knew that it was bad to eat, I guess, McDonald's, hamburgers, or so we've been talking about chicken nuggets in the chat here, but, and smoke a pack of cigarettes every day because it's bad for your heart health, right? So we're finally, and that it's important to exercise and do these and eat right and things like that. So all of these things that, we know cause heart attacks, that was from our learning of this in our society because doctors told us about that, and it was part and parcel of how we grew up. This sort of same notion of brain health, protecting your brain, staying mentally active, checking your hearing and your vision, and staying socially active, getting a good night's sleep because that matters for your brain health, eating right, exercise, all of this can really be translated in the Parkinson's space and hopefully help, possibly if you have a risk for Parkinson's, delay the diagnosis, but also if you've already been diagnosed, delay sort of the advancement and the slow down the trajectory of the disease. So that's sort of where we are. And so I think, hopefully if that analogy to like your heart and living better to prevent heart attacks can be used in the same way, I think, to sell this wellness to someone who may think it's, not something that matters to them.
And I think right along those lines, one of the challenges that I hear regularly is the negative connotation of going to see a therapist, right? That's really common, and there's a stigma associated with that for a lot of people, and it's beginning to see that there's not something wrong with me that's taking me to go see a therapist. There are just some things that I might learn to be able to do differently, right? It's not that my mind is broken, that I'm unable to deal with this depression. It's, can I find some coping strategies? Just some simple things that we talked about today. Any therapist that you go see can probably tell you the stuff that we talked about today on this talk about finding gratitude, about finding social connection, right? Those things are valuable. And if it's important for me to go see my movement disorder doc, go to the gym, eat right, get my sleep, going to have a conversation with someone who can maybe help me find some things in my life to improve my quality of life, it makes sense.
So there's a couple of other sort of comments here. One is about someone who's a physical therapist, Lisa, talks about the fact that some people had laughed at her and said that, wow, now that she has the diagnosis, you're just as smart as the rest of us now. And I think that sort of gets back to that sense of identity and the sense that, you may have, people may have put you on sort of a sense of, you're smart because you have this job, and now that you have the disease, you may be less than. And I think, that all needs to really be thought about in a very different framing. Additionally, I think sometimes people honestly don't know what to say. And I know people spend a lot of time being like, why would she say that to me? And I know, in my own health dealings and taking family members in to care, people get so like, the doctor said this, and like that was just like so mean, and I've just never been able to be the same. Like, you kind of just need to let stuff go sometimes with what people say, because sometimes in the moment they're kind of anxious and not really thinking about how to make sense of what to say to you. So, I wouldn't take it personally, and just, again, don't dwell on the past, move on, and really think about constructive ways to kind of move forward. There's also this comment, just a last thing, does PD lead to demoralization that leads to symptoms, or does PD lead to symptoms that lead to demoralization? I think these are a constant ebb and flow, and I'll let Brad have the last word, but, I think when you get a disease that doesn't have a cure, then, you feel different, and a change in suddenly, your life moving forward. And even if you don't have very many symptoms, people just with that diagnosis take time to kind of deal with the potential of the future, and the hopelessness and helplessness that they feel about their future, even if they don't have symptoms. So I think it's probably more, even from the day of diagnosis, a sense that somebody may have this or be at risk for getting it, sometimes can make them feel hopeless and helpless, and not have a way to sort of cope. But I'll let Brad sort of close us.
Yeah, as I read that question right before you said it, Indu, my answer was yes. Right. You asked which way it is, and yeah, it can go both ways, right? But typically, I think what we see is you probably don't begin to see the demoralization until you get the diagnosis, or even the prodromal state when you're beginning to have some things that you're starting to wonder, is everything okay? then I might begin to feel hopeless, helpless. And then as that goes on and that gets worse, my symptoms can get worse. And then it leads to more demoralization, right? And it's this cascade that just happens over time. So it's still not a really well understood construct in the PD world, quite frankly.
Thank you so much for allowing us to bring this concept to you and to learn from you as well in the chat. You guys have been really very interactive, and it's just fun to, work with Brad and elevate these ideas, and hopefully people will send the paper around and do more sort of thought thinking and feeding back to us about this, and stay tuned for the Wellness Task Force paper as well to come.
Thank you so much to both of you, Dr. Subramanian and Dr. McDaniels. I guess you could probably see the emotion, the emoticons coming up, the hearts and all of that. I think everyone is very grateful for your time today explaining all of this. This is such an important topic. So thank you, first of all, for tackling it in your paper. And then secondly, for coming and sharing your findings, your wisdom, and your insights on this, and giving a name to something that, people experience. So thank you so much to both of you. And I know, Dr. Subramanian, you've done this many times. Dr. McDaniels, you've been on as well. So you know our little tradition. So we can't clap, but we're going to wave. So everybody wave, a gratitude wave to both of our wonderful speakers today. Thank you so much, guys, for your expertise and time.